Welcome to another quiet journey into the distant past. As the world outside your window slows, and the quiet comforts of night settle in, let us drift gently into a different time, a world long forgotten by modern memory, yet still echoing through history's quiet halls. This is not a tale of kings and conquest, nor of heroism or grand design. Tonight, we explore something much simpler, much humbler, and perhaps more revealing, the everyday world of medieval hygiene. If you enjoy this kind of calm, slow storytelling, feel free to subscribe, only if it helps you rest a little easier. Let me know where and when you're listening tonight, whether you're under warm covers, lying quietly in a dim room, or just taking a quiet moment to yourself. Now, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you'd like, and let the flickering torches of the medieval past cast their soft glow around you. Let's begin. To understand hygiene in the medieval world, one must first release the expectations of modern cleanliness. Today, we live in a world awash with fragrant soaps, disinfectants, electric showers, flushing toilets, and endless advice about hand washing and dental care. In contrast, the medieval world was shaped by a very different set of beliefs, environments, and customs. For many people in medieval Europe, hygiene was less about eliminating germs, which they didn't even know existed, and more about balance, order, and spiritual cleanliness. The smells, sights, and sensations of daily life were far richer, more pungent, and often shockingly different from what we might imagine. The first thing a traveler would notice upon entering a medieval city or village would not be the buildings, the people, or even the sound of church bells. It would be the smell. Medieval streets often overflowed with human and animal waste, rotting food, stagnant puddles, and heaps of discarded refuse. There were no garbage trucks, no plumbing systems, and no sewers as we know them. Instead, waste flowed through open ditches called gutters or kennels that ran alongside or down the middle of cobblestone roads. These channels might carry rainwater when it was available, but more often they simply collected filth, breeding flies, rats, and diseases alike. Houses in most towns and cities were built closely together, leaning inward over narrow streets, their upper stories seeming to whisper secrets to each other above the heads of the passers-by. Beneath those eaves, chamber pots were emptied through windows or doorways, their contents splashing into the streets below with little warning and less ceremony. The cry, "Garde-la!" derived from the French garde as low or "watch out for the water," was sometimes used in cities like Edinburgh to warn pedestrians of the impending shower. But even with warning, accidents were common. Walking along a medieval street required a watchful eye and nimble footwork to avoid both the splatter and the puddles of uncertainty underfoot. Despite these unhygienic conditions, most people were not indifferent to cleanliness. They simply understood it differently. The concept of clean was often more symbolic or spiritual than physical. Bathing, for example, was not universally dismissed or avoided, quite the opposite. In the early and high Middle Ages, public bathhouses were common in many European cities, especially in places influenced by Roman and Islamic traditions. These bathhouses, often heated by wood-burning furnaces, provided not just a place to wash but also a social hub for relaxation, conversation, and sometimes more intimate activities. Patrons would undress, soak in hot water, scrape themselves with a curved blade called a strigil, and then rinse off, often in a communal fashion. Men and women sometimes bathed together, though this practice grew increasingly controversial and was eventually restricted or banned in many regions by religious and civic authorities. In monastic communities, hygiene took on a spiritual significance. Monks were often required to wash their hands and feet regularly, not necessarily out of concern for bacteria but as a symbolic act of humility and purity. Monasteries typically included lavatoriums, designated areas for washing, with stone basins fed by aqueducts or rainwater channels. Cleanliness in such communities was tied closely to ritual, just as much as physical well-being. Yet even here, bathing was often limited, sometimes to once a week, or even once a year, depending on the rules of the order and the availability of resources. The average peasant, living in the countryside or on the fringes of a village, had fewer options. Most rural homes had no running water and no designated bathing areas. water had to be fetched from wells, rivers, or streams, and was often saved for drinking or cooking rather than for washing the body. Bathing, when it did occur, was typically done in a wooden tub, if one was available, and might be a shared activity, with entire families reusing the same water in succession. This gave rise to expressions like, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," referring to the murky, reused state of the water by the time the youngest member of the family took their turn. Yet even those who bathed infrequently still practiced forms of personal hygiene that were familiar in spirit, if not in detail. People wiped their hands on cloths or aprons, cleaned their faces with dampened rags, and used a variety of natural materials to freshen their breath or scrub their teeth. Tooth powders made from crushed herbs, charcoal, and even chalk were used to polish teeth, though regular brushing was rare and dental decay was common. Mouthwashes were brewed from vinegar, wine, or myrrh, while some people chewed mint, sage, or cloves to mask unpleasant breath. Hair was combed with wooden or bone combs to remove lice and dirt, and head coverings were worn as much to protect from infestations as from sun or wind. The wealthier classes, of course, had more resources for cleanliness. Nobles and royals often had access to private bath chambers or elaborate bathing rituals, including perfumed oils, warm towels, and silver basins. Ladies of the court might bathe in rosewater or milk, while their servants poured heated water and scrubbed their backs with fine cloths. Clean linen was highly prized, not only for comfort but as a visible symbol of status and purity. The upper classes believed that wearing fresh, white linen against the skin was more effective at keeping the body clean than frequent bathing, a belief that, oddly enough, held some truth, as the linen would absorb sweat and dirt, which could then be washed away more easily than if left on the skin. Even so, luxury did not always guarantee cleanliness. Castles and manor houses often featured garderobes, small toilet rooms that opened over moats, or waste pits, but these facilities could be foul-smelling and poorly maintained. Chamber pots were used at night and emptied in the morning, while hand-washing might be limited to a small bowl and jug in the corner of a room. Fleas, lice, and rodents were common even in the homes of the rich, and the sweet perfumes used to mask unpleasant odors could do only so much. Religious teachings played a significant role in shaping medieval attitudes toward hygiene. In early Christianity, bathing was sometimes associated with vanity or indulgence. The body was seen as a vessel of sin, and too much attention to its appearance or comfort could be viewed with suspicion. Saints and ascetics were praised for enduring filth and hardship as signs of spiritual devotion. Saint Francis of Assisi, for example, was known for his extreme humility and avoidance of bodily comforts. Similarly, many medieval holy men and women were revered not despite their uncleanliness but because of it, as if their refusal to wash was proof of their spiritual purity. By the later Middle Ages, however, the picture began to shift. As urban populations grew and plagues swept across Europe, a more practical concern for cleanliness began to emerge. The Black Death, which decimated the population in the 14th century, prompted renewed attention to hygiene, though still rooted in flawed understandings of disease. People burned fragrant herbs, carried posies of flowers, or wore pomander filled with spices to ward off miasmas, or bad airs, which they believed carried disease. Bathhouses fell into decline, partly due to fears that hot water opened the pores to infection. Instead, dry washing, using cloths, powders, and perfumes, became more common, particularly among the wealthy. Cities began to implement rudimentary waste management systems, hiring street cleaners or requiring residents to dispose of refuse outside the city walls. Despite the chaos and contradictions, medieval people were not entirely ignorant of the dangers of poor hygiene. They observed patterns between filth and illness, even if they misunderstood the mechanisms. They valued cleanliness in ways that made sense within their worldview, as a balance of the humors, a reflection of moral order, or a sign of godliness. They improvised with what they had: reeds for wiping, ash for scrubbing, vinegar for rinsing. Their world may have smelled stronger, looked dirtier, and felt stickier than ours, but it was not without its own rhythms of care and cleanliness. In time, as we move deeper into this world, we'll explore how different regions, classes, and beliefs shaped the medieval understanding of hygiene, from the communal baths of Islamic Spain to the perfumed courts of France, from the plague doctors of Italy to the barefoot saints of Ireland. But for now, let this first glimpse settle gently into your thoughts, like the warmth of bathwater once drawn from a fire-heated cauldron, poured carefully into a worn wooden tub. Tomorrow, it will be reused. Tonight, it is enough. As we venture further into the murky but fascinating world of medieval hygiene, we must turn our attention to one of its most curious contradictions: the coexistence of widespread filth and deeply ingrained bathing rituals. The idea that medieval people never bathed at all is a common misconception, one that has been repeated so often it almost feels true. But in truth, washing of bodies, hands, faces, and even clothing was far more a part of daily life than most people imagine. The issue was not a lack of interest in cleanliness, but rather the limitations of infrastructure, resources, climate, and social customs. And so, while the streets may have reeked of sewage and smoke, behind closed doors and within the steamy walls of bathhouses, there were moments of warmth, ritual, and respite. In medieval Europe, public bathhouses were common features of many towns and cities, especially during the earlier parts of the Middle Ages. Influenced by the remains of Roman bathing culture, as well as Islamic traditions imported through Spain and the Crusades, these bathhouses were places where people of all classes might go to wash themselves, socialize, and even conduct business. Typically heated by wood-burning furnaces, they consisted of several rooms, a changing area, a warm room, a hot room filled with steam, and a cooler rinsing space. Large wooden tubs or stone basins were filled with heated water, and patrons would often scrub themselves with cloths or brushes, apply scented oils or ointments, and relax among others in the dimly lit, humid atmosphere. Bathhouses could be communal or private, and in some places, they were regulated by town councils or guilds. In cities like Paris, London, and Cologne, bathhouses were sometimes operated as commercial businesses, charging a small fee for entry, towels, and soap. Many offered additional services, such as massages, barbering, or even light refreshments. It was not uncommon for men and women to bathe together, especially during the early medieval period, though such practices would later come under scrutiny. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the Church began to express concerns about the morality of mixed bathing and the potential for sinful behavior within the steamy confines of the bathhouse. Regulations were introduced in some towns to separate the sexes or prohibit public nudity, but enforcement was often lax and varied by region. Despite these cultural tensions, bathing remained a regular activity for many people, particularly in urban centers. Merchants, apprentices, craftsmen, and even peasants made use of bathhouses when time and money allowed. For those who lived in the countryside, far from such facilities, bathing took on a simpler but no less meaningful form. Rivers, ponds, and lakes served as natural bathtubs during the warmer months, and villagers would sometimes gather to wash in communal spots, scrubbing themselves with handfuls of sand, herbs, or cloth. In the cold months, bathing indoors required both effort and planning. Water had to be drawn from wells or streams, carried in heavy buckets, and heated over fires. Wooden tubs, often barrel-shaped and large enough to sit in, would be filled slowly, and reused by multiple family members to conserve both water and firewood. Though the water might be tepid by the end, and certainly not sparkling clean, it represented a significant investment of time and labor, and thus became a kind of domestic ritual. Bathing was often associated with health, not in the sense of germ theory, which was centuries away, but in the context of humoral theory. According to medieval medical beliefs, the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Maintaining a proper balance of these humors was thought to be essential to health, and bathing was seen as a way to restore that balance. Warm water was believed to open the pores and allow harmful vapors or excess humors to escape. Herbal infusions were added to bathwater to enhance their therapeutic effect: rosemary for circulation, chamomile for relaxation, sage for strength, and lavender for sweetening the skin. Physicians sometimes prescribed baths as part of a treatment plan, particularly for skin conditions, fevers, or melancholy. The barber surgeons of the medieval world played a significant role in public hygiene as well. These professionals, often overlooked in modern interpretations, were a fixture in towns and villages alike. They were responsible for a variety of services, including cutting hair, shaving beards, lancing boils, setting broken bones, and performing basic surgeries such as tooth extractions and bloodletting. Many also ran small bathing operations, offering tubs, hot water, and medicinal washes. Their shops were often loud, lively places, filled with the sound of conversation, the scrape of razors, and the pungent smell of herbs and unwashed bodies. While their medical knowledge was limited, they were often the only form of healthcare available to the average person, and their work straddled the line between hygiene, grooming, and healing. Soap in the medieval period was a luxury, though not an unknown one. In many households, especially in urban areas, soap was made from animal fat and lye, creating a soft, strong-smelling substance that could be used for both laundry and body washing. Scented soaps, made with imported spices or floral essences, were particularly prized by the wealthy. In Islamic regions such as Moorish Spain, soap-making was an advanced art, and hard bar soaps made from olive oil and alkaline salts were exported across the Mediterranean. These soaps were more gentle on the skin and far more fragrant than their European counterparts. In Christian Europe, soap was often handmade in small batches, and stored in cloth-wrapped balls or wooden boxes, used sparingly due to its cost and limited availability. Clothing played an important role in medieval hygiene practices, not only as protection from the elements but also as a kind of substitute for washing the skin. It was widely believed that wearing clean linen helped keep the body clean, as the cloth absorbed sweat, oils, and dirt. For this reason, undergarments, particularly linen shirts and chemises, were changed more frequently than outer garments, and were considered essential for good hygiene. These linen items were laundered regularly, sometimes boiled in pots with ash or soapwood, and hung to dry in the sun. The scent of freshly washed linen was prized, and households with access to running water or well-organized laundry routines were seen as more refined and respectable. Yet not all aspects of hygiene were so structured. Personal grooming often fell to individual habits and preferences. People combed their hair with wide-toothed wooden or horn combs, sometimes sharing them within families. Fleas and lice were a constant nuisance, and combing became both a hygienic and social activity. Some households owned fine-toothed knit combs specifically designed to remove lice eggs, and mothers would often comb their children's hair by firelight in the evening. Head coverings such as coifs, hoods, and wimples were worn not only for modesty or fashion but also to keep hair clean and covered, reducing exposure to dust, smoke, and insects. Men shaved less frequently than today, but beards were trimmed and shaped with razors or small knives. Shaving creams didn't exist in the modern sense, so water, animal fat, or soap was used to soften the skin. Women plucked their eyebrows and sometimes removed facial hair using rough cloths or herbal pastes. Dental hygiene was rudimentary but not ignored. People used toothpicks made of wood or bone, rubbed their teeth with cloth or salt, and chewed aromatic herbs to clean their mouths. While tooth decay was common, particularly among the wealthy who consumed more sugar, tooth loss was often accepted as a part of aging, and dental pain was treated with poultices or extractions, the latter typically performed without anesthetic, by barbers or blacksmiths. Children were not exempt from hygiene rituals, though their cleanliness was often left in the hands of their mothers or older siblings. Babies were swaddled tightly, and their cloth wrappings had to be changed and washed regularly to avoid rashes or infections. Young children bathed with their parents or siblings and were often taught to wash their hands and faces with cold water before meals or prayers. Schoolmasters sometimes included cleanliness in their lessons, and religious instruction emphasized purity of both the body and soul. The role of women in maintaining household hygiene cannot be overstated. Women were typically responsible for fetching water, washing clothes, preparing baths, tending to the sick, and cleaning household surfaces. In noble households, these tasks were delegated to servants, while in peasant homes, they were part of daily labor. Women often knew how to make soap, brew herbal rinses, and treat minor skin conditions. They passed down knowledge of which herbs to use for sores, which powders to keep fleas away, and how to prevent or soothe infections. This body of practical knowledge formed the foundation of domestic hygiene, even in the absence of formal medicine. Of course, hygiene in medieval times was not a fixed or universal standard. Practices varied greatly across regions, classes, and cultures. In Islamic Spain, for instance, cleanliness was closely tied to religious practice. Muslims were required to perform ablutions before prayer, and bathing facilities were widespread, sophisticated, and well-maintained. Hammams, Islamic bathhouses, featured elegant tilework, domed ceilings, and a series of warm, hot, and cold rooms, offering both physical and spiritual purification. In contrast, in parts of northern Europe, where winters were long and harsh, bathing was more seasonal and sometimes discouraged due to concerns about cold water weakening the body or opening it to illness. Still, within every culture and every community, people adapted to their circumstances with resourcefulness and intention. They scraped, scrubbed, soaked, and scoured. They endured lice, managed sweat, masked smells, and took comfort in rituals of cleanliness that were as much about identity and dignity as about sanitation. A warm bath, no matter how infrequent, could provide not only relief but also renewal. It could wash away more than just dirt. It could offer a moment of peace in a world that was often brutal and uncertain. As we close this chapter, imagine a small bathhouse at dusk, its wooden beams glowing in firelight, its interior humming with the soft splash of water and the murmur of voices. Outside, the streets may be muddy and foul, but within these walls, there is warmth. Steam rises, scents drift through the air, rosemary, smoke, and soap. For a few quiet moments, a weary traveler, a tired mother, a cautious merchant, they all find comfort in the age-old ritual of washing. And tomorrow, they will return to the noise and mess of the world once more, just a little lighter than before. While bathing may have offered moments of cleanliness and comfort, medieval hygiene would have been incomplete, and perhaps misrepresented, without an honest exploration of the less glamorous side of cleanliness, the disposal of human waste. Sanitation in the medieval world was a challenge that touched every household, regardless of wealth or status. Without the benefit of modern plumbing, sewage systems, or running water, people of the Middle Ages had to contend with the realities of defecation and waste disposal using the tools, knowledge, and customs of their time. The result was a patchwork of ingenious, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright alarming practices that defined the medieval experience of cleanliness in a deeply human, and deeply humbling, way. The most basic and ubiquitous solution to this problem was the chamber pot. Present in nearly every home, from the grandest castle to the smallest peasant hut, the chamber pot was a simple vessel, usually ceramic, metal, or wood-lined, that served as a portable toilet. Tucked beneath beds, hidden behind curtains, or stored in corners, these pots allowed people to relieve themselves indoors, particularly during the night or in bad weather. The convenience came at a cost, of course. Chamber pots had to be emptied regularly, and this task often fell to the lowest-ranking members of the household, servants, children, or the unfortunate spouse. The contents were typically dumped into a nearby ditch, onto a dung heap, or, in urban settings, out of the nearest window, with a shouted warning to passers-by below. In cities, the streets themselves often became the final destination for human waste. Without underground sewage systems, towns and urban centers relied on a combination of open gutters, covered drains, and sheer improvisation to manage the overwhelming volume of refuse produced by growing populations. The gutters, shallow channels carved along the sides of streets or sometimes directly down the middle, were designed to carry rainwater away from buildings. But in the absence of heavy or consistent rain, these channels often stagnated, collecting not only water but also rotting food, spilled ale, animal droppings, and the constant stream of human excrement thrown from windows and doors. The resulting stench was overpowering, particularly in summer months, and cities were known to reek long before a traveler reached the gates. The wealthy had slightly more refined options. Castles, monasteries, and larger manor homes often included latrines or privies, primitive toilets constructed to offer a little more dignity, and occasionally, privacy. In castles, these were known as garderobes, small rooms or alcoves built into the thick stone walls, usually near the outer edge of the structure. A hole in a stone or wooden seat allowed waste to drop straight down into a pit, moat, or running stream below. In some designs, multiple garderobes were built side by side to accommodate several users at once, and they might be tucked away in turrets or connected to spiral staircases. While these facilities offered shelter from the elements, they were hardly pleasant. The lack of ventilation, combined with the accumulation of waste and the absence of proper flushing systems, meant that even the grandest latrines were damp, dark, and malodorous. To mitigate the stench, medieval people employed a range of strategies. Herbs such as mint, lavender, and rosemary were hung near toilet areas or burned as incense. Rushes or straw were spread across the floors to soak up moisture and mask smells, though these quickly became saturated and were not always replaced with the frequency one might hope. In castles and monasteries, garderobes might be placed above rivers or moving water to help carry waste away, but this solution posed its own problems, especially during dry seasons or in times of siege when water sources were scarce or contaminated. It was not uncommon for waste to back up or for foul odors to drift upward into living quarters, particularly in warmer weather. In monasteries and abbeys, sanitation reflected both the religious values and the communal nature of monastic life. Many large monasteries had carefully designed latrine buildings, sometimes called necessaria, built over streams or channels that could carry waste away. These buildings were often large enough to serve an entire monastic community, and were sometimes attached to the dormitories for easy access. Rows of seats, set above flowing water or deep pits, allowed multiple monks to relieve themselves in a shared, though solemn, space. Washing areas were usually located nearby, with running water fed by aqueducts or diverted from local springs. The monastic emphasis on ritual purity meant that handwashing was required after visiting the latrine, and basins, called lavabos, were strategically placed outside cloisters or dining halls. Outside of religious communities, the situation was generally more chaotic. In rural villages, the solution was often simple: people went outdoors. The edge of a field, a wooded glade, a secluded hedge, or even a designated corner of the garden might serve as an informal toilet. Some homes had rudimentary privies, wooden outhouses built over pits dug into the ground. These were often shared by several families, especially in densely populated areas, and required regular emptying to prevent overflow. The task of cleaning out latrines and cesspits was unpleasant, dangerous, and often performed at night to avoid offending the sensibilities of others. The men who did this work were known as gong farmers in England, a title derived from the Old English gang, meaning to go. Gong farmers were paid relatively well, considering the filthiness of the job, but they were often shunned by society and forced to live on the outskirts of town. The dangers of poor sanitation were well known, even if misunderstood. People made a connection between foul smells and illness, though they lacked the scientific framework to explain how diseases were transmitted. The prevailing theory of the time was the miasma theory, the belief that sickness spread through bad air or invisible clouds of corruption. As such, people took steps to avoid or combat these odors. Streets were occasionally swept, dung heaps were regulated in some cities, and laws were passed prohibiting the dumping of waste near wells or churches. In London, regulations dating back to the 13th century tried to control the disposal of waste in the Thames River and required homeowners to keep the areas in front of their homes clean. Enforcement was inconsistent, but the efforts signaled a growing awareness of the link between cleanliness and health. For all its crudeness, the medieval approach to waste management was not entirely without logic or care. In some towns, designated areas were set aside for waste disposal, including dung heaps, midden piles, and communal latrine pits. These areas were usually located on the outskirts of town or near butcher shops and tanneries, industries already associated with strong smells and unsanitary conditions. Human waste was sometimes collected and used as fertilizer, mixed with straw and animal manure and spread across fields. This practice was not without risk, as untreated waste could carry pathogens, but it represented an early form of recycling that reflected a pragmatic use of limited resources. Interestingly, there were cultural and linguistic differences in how people spoke about and understood human waste. In many medieval texts, references to bodily functions were veiled in euphemism or humor. Medical manuals might describe evacuations or humoral excesses, while poems and plays often employed jokes or double meanings. In private conversation, people used familiar expressions to go to the garden, visit the hedge, or pay a call to the seat. These euphemisms offered a layer of social politeness, even as the realities of medieval sanitation remained unapologetically earthy. The issue of menstruation, often overlooked in historical discussions of hygiene, also reveals much about the challenges medieval people faced in managing bodily functions without modern conveniences. Women used a variety of methods to manage their menstrual flow, including rags, moss, wool, or even padded cloth belts called girdles. These items had to be cleaned by hand, often in cold water, and dried discreetly. There were no disposable products, no private bathrooms, and very little public discourse on the subject. Women relied on the knowledge of other women, mothers, sisters, midwives, to navigate this natural but often stigmatized aspect of hygiene. Children, too, were subject to the constraints of medieval sanitation. Infants wore swaddling bands that were regularly changed and washed, though not always with sufficient frequency. Older children were expected to relieve themselves in the same ways as adults, using chamber pots, outdoor areas, or shared latrines. Toilet training was informal and relied heavily on observation and imitation. Accidents were common, and laundry was frequent, if laborious. Despite all of these limitations, it would be a mistake to see medieval people as indifferent to cleanliness. They were simply constrained by the materials, knowledge, and infrastructure available to them. They developed systems, however flawed, to manage waste, minimize exposure, and maintain a degree of privacy and dignity. They swept, scrubbed, perfumed, and prayed. They adapted their surroundings and rituals to match their beliefs about the body, health, and society. As we leave this chapter behind, imagine once more the narrow alleys of a medieval town at twilight. A servant empties a chamber pot into the gutter, murmuring an apology to no one in particular. A monk steps quietly from the cloister to the latrine, candle in hand. A child tugs at their mother's apron, asking to be taken behind the garden hedge. The air is heavy, the ground uneven, and the smell unforgettable, yet in all of it, a rhythm persists. Life carries on, waste is managed, and the work of being human continues in all its messy, determined grace. While we often think of hygiene in terms of the body, much of a medieval person's sense of cleanliness, and the visible signs of it, came from their clothing. In a world where daily bathing was rare, and plumbing was non-existent, fresh linens and clean garments carried immense weight. They served not only a practical purpose but also a symbolic one, signaling status, piety, diligence, and even moral character. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages was far more than a casual chore. It was a physically demanding, time-consuming, and socially significant act, one that shaped the rhythms of rural and urban life alike. At the heart of medieval clothing hygiene was linen, a smooth, durable fabric made from the flax plant. Unlike wool, which was heavier and harder to clean, linen could be washed regularly, and was typically worn as the layer closest to the skin. Whether one was a peasant in a humble tunic, or a noble lady in a fine gown, the undergarments beneath the outer clothing were usually made of linen. These linen pieces, such as shirts, chemises, brays, linen underwear, and coifs, absorbed the body's sweat, oils, and dirt, acting as a barrier between the skin and the heavier, often unwashed outer layers. This strategy of layering was, in effect, a practical hygiene method. Rather than wash an expensive woolen cloak or elaborate dress, one could simply change the linen layer underneath. The responsibility of maintaining this cleanliness fell, almost without exception, to women. Whether they were servants in a noble household, nuns in a convent, or mothers managing a busy farmstead, women bore the full weight of laundering clothes for their families and communities. Laundry days were not weekly events, as they might be in modern life, but were scheduled around available time, weather conditions, and the accumulation of soiled linens. In some places, large-scale washing took place only a few times each season, while undergarments and cloths used for hygiene might be washed more frequently, depending on access to water and fuel. The tools of laundry were simple but effective. Large wooden tubs or barrels, known as washing vats, were used to soak and scrub garments. Ashes from wood fires, particularly hardwoods, were collected and used to make lye, a basic cleaning agent. This was done by pouring water through the ashes and collecting the resulting liquid, which was highly alkaline and served to strip oils and stains from fabric. Soap, when available, was made from animal fat and lye, forming a thick, pasty substance that could be rubbed directly onto stains or added to boiling water. The process was abrasive and required strong hands, particularly when rubbing fabric against wooden washboards or scrubbing stones to lift dirt. Washing often took place near natural water sources, rivers, streams, and wells, which provided a constant supply of fresh water and a convenient location for rinsing. It was not uncommon to see groups of women gathered along riverbanks, bent over rocks, sleeves rolled up, lifting dripping cloth from the water and beating it rhythmically against smooth stones. These scenes, so often romanticized in art or folklore, were as much social gatherings as they were laborious tasks. Women shared news, sang songs, swapped remedies for stains or insects, and occasionally gossiped about the goings-on in the village or town. The act of laundering became a form of community maintenance, not just in terms of hygiene, but in reinforcing social ties. Once washed, clothes were wrung out by hand, a strenuous task with heavy, soaked linen, and laid out to dry in the sun. Fields, fences, hedgerows, and even rooftops became makeshift drying racks. In larger households, special drying rooms or open courtyards were designated for this purpose. Sunlight played a vital role in the process, not only evaporating moisture but also helping to bleach and sanitize fabric. Whites were often spread out longest, and bright sunlight was welcomed for its cleansing effects. In colder or wetter months, drying became more difficult, and damp laundry had to be hung near hearths or in lofts, sometimes taking days to fully dry and developing an unpleasant musty odor in the process. The notion of clean clothing in the medieval world did not mean fragrant or soft in the modern sense. Even well-washed linen might retain a faint smell of ash, smoke, or sweat, and most people accepted this as part of daily life. Still, clean linen was seen as a hallmark of good character, particularly in religious and upper-class circles. Monks and nuns were often required to wear freshly laundered habits during ceremonies or feast days, and wealthy families took pride in their clean linens, displaying them prominently in homes or using them for guests. The ability to maintain fresh clothing was closely linked to one's resources, labor force, and household structure, a quiet but powerful symbol of order, piety, and prosperity. Garments that could not be washed, such as embroidered dresses, fur-lined cloaks, or leather doublets, were maintained using alternative methods. Brushing, shaking, and airing garments in the open air helped remove dust and odors. Perfumed sachets made from dried herbs and flowers were stored in clothing chests to impart pleasant smells and deter moths. In some cases, garments were smoked over fires to kill insects and mask body odor, though this could leave clothes smelling strongly of soot. Fur was especially difficult to clean and was often maintained by professional furriers, who used specialized tools and powders to brush and freshen the pelts. For the poor, the options were more limited. Many peasants owned only one or two changes of clothing, and their outer garments were rarely, if ever, washed. Instead, these clothes were patched, repaired, and worn until they were no longer usable. Linen undergarments, however, were still washed when possible, and families prioritized keeping them clean even if the rest of their wardrobe was ragged. It was not uncommon for children to go naked or semi-clothed in the warmer months, in part to save wear and tear on limited clothing. When fabric became too worn to wear, it was repurposed into rags, cleaning cloths, or bandages, ensuring that no scrap went to waste. In noble and royal households, laundering was a more refined operation, often delegated to a team of servants known as laundresses or washerwomen. These women managed an entire laundry process within the estate, overseeing washing, drying, mending, starching, and folding. Detailed records were sometimes kept to account for the number and condition of each item, especially when preparing wardrobes for travel or public appearances. Some royal households even had designated linen closets and storage rooms known as wardrobes, from which the modern term for clothing collection derives. The work was intensive and required both physical stamina and knowledge of fabric care, particularly when handling delicate embroidery, imported silks, or expensive lace. Interestingly, laundering also intersected with religious practice. In many convents, the act of washing clothes was imbued with spiritual significance, representing humility, service, and purity. Nuns took turns in the laundry house, scrubbing habits and altar linens, often while reciting prayers or psalms. Special attention was given to the cloth used in religious ceremonies, altar cloths, vestments, and baptismal garments, which were washed with care, dried in sanctified spaces, and stored with reverence. This blending of the practical and the sacred reflected a broader medieval worldview in which physical cleanliness was linked, however tenuously, to spiritual well-being. There were, of course, challenges and taboos. In some regions, public washing was seen as immodest or inappropriate, especially when it involved women working in their shifts or lifting heavy wet clothes that clung to the body. Laws and customs arose to regulate when and where washing could take place, and in certain towns, public laundry spots were limited to specific days of the week. Conflicts occasionally broke out over access to clean water or disputes about laundry locations, particularly during times of drought or disease. Washerwomen were both respected and pitied, admired for their hard work and essential role, yet also associated with lower social status, physical exhaustion, and exposure to harsh elements. Laundry also carried risks. The act of lifting and wringing heavy garments, standing in cold water, and breathing in ash or lye fumes took a toll on the body. Women who did laundry regularly developed calloused hands, sore backs, and respiratory problems. In winter, the exposure to freezing water could lead to frostbite or illness. In larger urban areas, washerwomen sometimes had to compete with the pollution of nearby tanneries, dye workshops, or slaughterhouses, which contaminated water sources and left laundry stained or foul-smelling despite the effort. Despite all of this, the persistence of laundry routines across centuries speaks to a deeply rooted human need, not only for cleanliness, but for rhythm, order, and care. Washing clothes was an act of transformation, turning something soiled and odorous into something fresh and wearable. It reaffirmed a sense of control in a world filled with unpredictability, weather, illness, war, and death. It also fostered a connection to others, the shared labor of community wash days, the passing down of techniques from mother to daughter, the collective responsibility for preserving the garments that marked one's identity. As we conclude this chapter, let us pause to picture a quiet meadow by a stream on a spring morning. A group of women, wrapped in aprons and headscarves, kneel at the water's edge. The air is filled with the sound of splashing, laughter, and the soft thud of cloth against stone. Wet linen ripples in the breeze, draped over bushes and low branches. A child plays nearby, tossing pebbles into the water. A scent of wood smoke, sun-warmed fabric, and early blooms fills the air. In this simple, grounded scene, there is both labor and serenity, a reminder that even the humblest acts of hygiene held beauty, rhythm, and meaning in the medieval world. If one were to walk through the great market squares, narrow alleys, and candlelit halls of the medieval world, one would quickly become aware of something both subtle and overwhelming: the smell. The air in medieval towns was thick with the mingled scents of firewood smoke, dung, sweat, cooking meat, wet wool, and decaying refuse. For the modern nose, this aromatic fog might seem intolerable, but for the people who lived in it, scent was both a constant companion and a meaningful part of daily life. It wasn't just something to endure. It was something to manage, manipulate, and occasionally transform. In a time before antiseptics and synthetic fragrances, people relied on natural substances to mask, sweeten, or purify the smells around them. These were not luxuries reserved for nobles, though the quality and quantity of such items differed by class, but tools of daily hygiene and ritual, rooted in centuries of folk knowledge, religious symbolism, and emerging medical theory. From bundles of herbs hung over doorways to perfumed handkerchiefs tucked into sleeves, The medieval world was filled with aromatic strategies, a fragrant battleground in the eternal fight against filth. One of the most common tools in this battle was the herb. Herbs were easy to grow, dry, and store, and even small households kept bunches of lavender, sage, thyme, rosemary, mint, and rue on hand for both culinary and hygienic use. These herbs were not only added to food, but also scattered on floors, burned in censers, infused into wash water, or tucked into clothing chests. Floors, particularly in wealthier homes and churches, were often strewn with rushes or straw mixed with aromatic herbs, a practice known as strewing. This carpet of greenery served a dual purpose. It helped absorb moisture and waste that might fall to the floor, and it released pleasant scents when walked upon or brushed aside. The richer the household, the more frequently these rushes were changed, a quiet signal of wealth and refinement. In churches, castles, and noble estates, more complex fragrances were also in use. Pomanders, small, perforated containers filled with fragrant resins, spices, or herbs, were worn on belts, carried in pockets, or hung around the neck. Some were simple wooden or cloth sachets, while others were crafted from gold, silver, or carved ivory. Within these tiny chambers were mixtures of musk, ambergris, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, or frankincense, designed not just to smell pleasant but to offer protection. According to the miasma theory, which dominated medieval understandings of disease, foul smells carried illness. If you could keep the bad air at bay, or at least replace it with something more agreeable, you might avoid infection altogether. This belief led to the widespread use of sweet-smelling accessories during times of plague. People carry nosegays, small bouquets of herbs and flowers, pressed to their faces as they walked through cities, particularly if they had to pass by hospitals, graveyards, or strangers. Physicians wore long robes and masks with beak-like extensions filled with aromatic materials, hoping to filter the air and protect themselves from the corruption they believed floated invisibly through crowded spaces. Even in daily life, it was common for people to sniff sprigs of mint or rosemary when passing through a foul-smelling area, or to chew cloves or fennel to freshen their breath before speaking with a superior. Bathing practices also included aromatic elements. When possible, herbs were added to the bathwater, not merely to soothe the skin, but to enhance the sensory experience of bathing. Chamomile, rose petals, sage, and marjoram were all popular additions, and some recipes included entire sachets of bundled herbs steeped like tea in the steaming water. For those unable to bathe frequently, aromatic powders and oils were used to refresh the skin. Powders made from ground herbs, flower petals, or chalk could be brushed onto the body or hair to absorb oils and leave behind a faint fragrance. Oils, often made by steeping herbs or spices in animal fat or olive oil, were rubbed into the skin to soften and scent it. These oils were especially popular among the wealthy, who could afford imported ingredients and dedicated servants to apply them. Perfume, as a refined and luxurious commodity, was another realm altogether. While the concept of perfume had existed since antiquity, it was during the medieval period, especially in the Islamic world, that its production and use became an art form. In cities such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, skilled alchemists and perfumers distilled flower essences, resins, and woods into potent oils and waters. These fragrances traveled across trade routes into Europe, where they were prized by nobles, clergy, and merchants alike. In courts and royal households, perfumes were used to scent clothing, gloves, bed linens, and even writing paper. Some aristocrats went so far as to have their rooms fumigated with burning incense, or their bathwater mixed with imported rosewater. For most commoners, these refined perfumes were out of reach, but simpler forms of scent still played a role in daily life. The act of airing out bedding and garments was a routine hygiene practice, and it served not only to remove odors but also to allow exposure to sunlight, which people believed had purifying powers. Hanging clothes and blankets outside, especially in breezy, open areas, was a way to refresh them without washing. Scented sachets, tucked into closets or sewn into garments, added another layer of olfactory cleanliness. Common ingredients for these sachets included dried rose petals, cloves, bay leaves, or wood shavings soaked in vinegar or oil. The link between scent and virtue was not just practical, it was deeply symbolic. In religious texts, saints were sometimes described as having bodies that gave off sweet, otherworldly smells, a sign of their divine purity. Conversely, sin, corruption, and demonic presence were often associated with foul stenches. This gave rise to a kind of moral olfaction. To smell good was to be good, or at least to try. Pilgrims might carry scented relics or anoint themselves with holy oils. Priests swung censers filled with incense during Mass not just for pageantry, but to sanctify the air and elevate the spirit. The scent of frankincense was believed to drive away evil and invite holiness. Women, in particular, were closely associated with the world of scent. While men used herbs and powders for cleanliness and protection, women were more likely to be both the creators and custodians of household fragrances. They dried herbs in kitchens, sewed sachets, mixed floral waters, and passed down recipes for salves and perfumes through generations. Courtly literature often described women's beauty in terms of scent: the fragrance of their hair, the sweetness of their breath, the delicate aroma of their skin, linking physical hygiene to allure and virtue. In some regions, young women wore garlands of herbs in their hair or braided sprigs of rosemary into ribbons, both as adornment and as a fragrant signal of purity. Yet not all medieval scent practices were about pleasure or prevention. Some were rituals of mourning, cleansing, or protection. When someone died, the body was often anointed with herbs and oils to mask decomposition before burial. In times of plague, households burned strong-smelling substances such as sulfur, vinegar, or pine resin in an attempt to purify the air. During childbirth, incense might be burned or lavender strewn around the bed to protect both mother and child from evil spirits or disease. Scent, in all of these moments, became a kind of invisible armor, a way to confront the uncertain forces that governed medieval life. Even in the marketplace, scent played a role. Vendors sold bundles of fresh herbs, jars of oil, bundles of dried flowers, and small bottles of rosewater or vinegar for personal use. Traveling peddlers might carry perfumed beads or wax tablets scented with honey and resin, and these were sometimes given as gifts or love tokens. The scent of a particular spice or blossom could evoke a season, a memory, a person. Without modern soaps and deodorizers, the way a person smelled was far more personal, far more distinctive. You knew your family, your neighbors, your lord or lady, not just by their voice or clothing, but by the familiar scent that surrounded them. To step into a medieval home, even a modest one, was to enter a space carefully curated by scent. The hearth might carry the warm, woody smell of peat or oak. The bedding might bear traces of lavender or chamomile. The storage chest might whisper of cedar or bay. Amid the sweat, smoke, and dampness, people sought, and often found, comfort through small acts of aromatic care. These were not simply indulgences. They were acts of resistance, hope, and order in a world where filth and danger loomed around every corner. As we close this chapter, imagine yourself walking through a medieval herb garden in early evening. The light is soft, the breeze is cool, and the air is alive with the mingled aromas of thyme, sage, marigold, and mint. Somewhere nearby, a woman plucks rose petals to dry for a sachet. A child gathers lavender stems to hang in the sleeping quarters. In the distance, someone burns incense in a chapel. And though the streets may stink and the wells may fester, within these small, fragrant moments, people find comfort. They find control. They find, however fleeting, a breath of sweetness in an otherwise unscented world. When we speak of hygiene, our thoughts often begin with the body and skin, the act of bathing, washing clothes, or dealing with filth underfoot. Yet one of the most enduring and deeply personal aspects of hygiene has always been oral care. The condition of a person's mouth, breath, and teeth was just as important in the Middle Ages as it is today, not necessarily for sparkling white smiles or fresh minty breath, but for speaking clearly, chewing well, and avoiding the persistent agony of toothaches. While medieval people lacked modern dentistry, toothbrushes, and antiseptic mouthwashes, they nonetheless developed their own complex rituals, tools, and beliefs surrounding oral hygiene. These practices, though primitive by today's standards, were surprisingly thoughtful, a mixture of folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and physical maintenance, rooted in necessity. The medieval understanding of dental health began, as so many things did, with the theory of the four humors. According to this dominant medical philosophy, the body was governed by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and any imbalance among them could cause disease. Bad breath, loose teeth, or swollen gums were not seen as problems of bacteria or plaque, but as signs of excess heat, dryness, or internal corruption. A toothache might be attributed to hot humors rising into the head, or to cold vapors lodging in the jaw. Treatments, therefore, aim to restore balance through diet, bleeding, purging, or the application of cooling or drying substances. Despite these misguided theories, people in the Middle Ages were not indifferent to their mouths. In fact, much attention was paid to oral cleanliness, particularly among those who had the means and time to manage it. One of the most common daily practices was tooth cleaning, not with a modern toothbrush, but with simple tools such as cloths, fingers, and natural abrasives. Many people used a piece of linen or rough cloth wrapped around the finger to rub their teeth clean. Others used twigs, chewed until one end became frayed into bristles. These were called chew sticks, and they served much the same purpose as a toothbrush, though with far more variation in effectiveness. To enhance the cleaning, a variety of powders and pastes were used. Tooth powders were made by grinding natural substances such as salt, charcoal, dried mint, sage, fennel seeds, rosemary, or even crushed seashells and bones. These powders were rubbed onto the teeth using the cloth or stick, then rinsed away with water or herbal infusions. Some recipes included vinegar or honey to improve taste and texture, though vinegar was known to erode enamel, even if medieval people didn't fully understand the mechanism. Charcoal, while abrasive, had mild antibacterial properties and was especially popular among those who could obtain it easily from cooking fires. Mouth rinses were another regular part of oral care. People rinsed their mouths with water after meals, particularly after eating meat or sweets. Herbal rinses, made by boiling mint, sage, or thyme in water, were used to freshen the breath and soothe sore gums. Some people added wine, vinegar, or salt to their rinses, believing these additions helped kill harmful vapors or balance the humors. In wealthier households, imported spices such as cinnamon, cloves, or myrrh might be added for their aromatic and medicinal properties. A small amount was swished, sometimes gargled, and then spit into a basin or onto the ground, a brief, refreshing ritual that could be repeated several times a day. Bad breath, or foul breath, as it was often called, was taken seriously. It was not only a sign of potential illness but also a source of social embarrassment. People used breath fresheners in many forms, chewing parsley or mint leaves, sucking on anise or fennel seeds, or carrying sachets of cloves to place in the mouth during important conversations. Some physicians recommended scraping the tongue gently with a piece of wood or horn to remove buildup, while others advised avoiding foods that caused offensive odors, such as garlic, onions, or strong cheeses. In religious communities, where silence was often observed, fresh breath was especially important during communal prayers or chants. Monks and nuns might rinse or freshen their mouths before gathering in the chapel, a small act of respect toward their neighbors in sacred space. But despite these efforts, dental problems were common. Tooth decay, gum disease, abscesses, and tooth loss afflicted people of all classes. The causes were many: limited oral care tools, poor nutrition, injuries, and the natural wear of a hard life. Sugar, while not widespread among the poor, became increasingly available to the wealthy during the later Middle Ages due to trade with the East. This led to more cavities and decay in the upper classes, while peasants who subsisted on coarser grains and fewer luxuries often lost teeth from simple wear and tear. The enamel of medieval teeth reveals a great deal to modern archaeologists. Some individuals had severe tartar buildup, others clear signs of childhood malnutrition or abscesses that eventually reached the bone. When a tooth went bad, the treatment options were few. Mild pain might be managed with herbal poultices, warm saltwater rinses, or clove oil applied directly to the gum. These remedies offered some relief, but were not cures. For more serious dental issues, extraction was the most common solution. Performed by barber surgeons, blacksmiths, or even enterprising neighbors, tooth pulling was done without anesthesia and often in unsanitary conditions. The instruments ranged from basic tongs and knives to more specialized devices known as tooth keys, which were twisted against the gum to lever the tooth free. The process was excruciating, and complications, broken roots, infection, or damage to the jaw, were frequent. In some cases, dentists were more specialized. In cities and wealthy towns, itinerant tooth drawers set up shop in market squares or traveled door to door, advertising their services with painted signs or crude models of teeth. These practitioners, some skilled, some charlatans, offered extractions, denture fittings, and even cosmetic treatments. False teeth were made from ivory, bone, or the teeth of animals, and sometimes even from human corpses. They were lashed to existing teeth with wire or glued into place with pitch, resin, or soft wax. These prosthetics were rarely functional for chewing but were used to restore the appearance of a full mouth, especially among nobles or clergy who appeared before the public. The care of gums and the inner mouth was also important. Bleeding gums, ulcers, or mouth worms, likely referring to severe infections or parasites, were treated with herbal salves and tinctures. Sage, myrrh, and vinegar were considered cleansing, while cooling herbs such as plantain or chamomile were used to reduce swelling. Some remedies called for the patient to bite on a hot cloth soaked in wine or hold warm stones in the mouth to draw out poison. Religious texts sometimes recommended prayer or fasting as a cure for persistent mouth ailments, viewing them as punishments for vanity or gluttony. In monasteries, dental care was folded into the larger cycle of humility and self-denial. Pain was endured, relief was earned through obedience. Children's teeth received less attention, as baby teeth were seen as temporary and not worthy of much care. That said, mothers still cleaned their children's mouths with cloth and water, taught them to rinse, and gave them herbs to chew for fresh breath. Losing a tooth was celebrated or noted with small rituals. In some places, children tossed the lost tooth over the roof for luck. In others, they buried it or gave it to a family member as a keepsake. Teething infants were soothed with cloth-wrapped herbs, wooden teething rings, or cooled stones. Socially, teeth carried meaning. A person with healthy, clean teeth was seen as youthful, vigorous, and respectable. Blackened or missing teeth could signify illness, age, poverty, or moral weakness. In some parts of Europe, stained teeth were intentionally whitened using chalk or crushed pearls, though these methods weakened the enamel. In portraits of noblemen and women, smiles were rare, partly due to artistic convention but also because dental flaws were common and difficult to conceal. Among the lower classes, dental imperfections were accepted as part of life's hardships. But even peasants valued a clean mouth and sought to maintain it with the tools they had. As we imagine the end of a day in medieval life, the scenes of oral care may seem quaint or strange. A woman rinses her mouth with sage water beside a stone basin. A monk chews a clove before evening prayers. A peasant father uses a willow twig to scrape his back molars, then teaches his son to do the same. The tools are simple, the methods coarse, but the intent is recognizable. A desire to feel clean, to avoid pain, to greet others without shame, these small acts of care echo across centuries. Though the taste of mint may have been rare, and fluoride unknown, the desire for a fresh mouth, a painless smile, and a healthy breath was as real then as it is now. In a world filled with dirt, decay, and hardship, even the act of chewing a sprig of parsley or rinsing with vinegar water became a kind of quiet triumph, a way of saying, "I am still here. I am still clean." In the medieval world, where science and superstition often blended seamlessly, there was perhaps no institution more influential in shaping hygiene practices than the church. The church's reach extended into every corner of life, from birth to burial, from the marketplace to the monastery, and its teachings shaped not only how people thought about their souls, but also how they cared for their bodies. Cleanliness in this context was not purely a matter of health or comfort. It was a symbol, a spiritual practice, a reflection of one's inner state. The idea that cleanliness is next to godliness, while not directly quoted from medieval texts, echoes the broader belief that physical purity and moral virtue were deeply intertwined. For monks, nuns, and other members of the religious orders, hygiene was part of the daily routine, grounded in centuries-old rules and rituals. Most monastic communities followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which, while focused on prayer and labor, also included instructions on cleanliness and bodily care. Monks were expected to wash their hands before meals, their feet before bed, and their faces each morning as a sign of readiness for worship. Although bathing the entire body was less frequent, it was not prohibited. In fact, monasteries often had access to running water, stone lavatoriums, and even rudimentary bathhouses, which allowed for regular washing, particularly before important religious festivals or communal events. These lavatoriums, typically located just outside the cloister near the refectory, dining hall, were long stone troughs or basins, fed by aqueducts or rainwater channels, with small spouts or taps. Monks would wash their hands in silence, sometimes using ash or sand to scrub, before filing into the dining area. In some monasteries, a designated brother would ring a bell or read a passage of scripture during this ritual, blending the act of physical cleansing with spiritual contemplation. Towels were shared but maintained carefully, and washing cloths were laundered on a regular schedule, often by lay brothers or female servants attached to the monastery. In convents, hygiene routines were similar but tailored to the specific needs of the nuns. These women, often cut off from the outside world, still took great care in personal grooming, particularly before communal prayers. Hair was kept short or covered, fingernails trimmed, and hands clean. Many convents had herbal gardens where medicinal plants were grown for making washes, ointments, and infused waters used in daily routines. These herbal remedies served dual purposes, maintaining bodily cleanliness and treating minor ailments, and the women who administered them were often skilled in folk medicine passed down through generations. For the laity, that is, everyday believers who were not part of the clergy, the Church's influence on hygiene came primarily through ritual and instruction. One of the most significant and widespread religious hygiene practices was the act of washing before prayer or entering sacred spaces. Before receiving communion, worshippers were expected to cleanse themselves, at least by washing the hands and face, if not by bathing entirely. Pilgrims visiting holy sites were often encouraged to bathe beforehand, either at public bathhouses or in nearby streams believed to have healing properties. Water from these pilgrimage sites, such as Lourdes in later centuries, or the shrine of Saint Winifred in Wales, was bottled and taken home, used not only for healing but for ritual washing. The sacrament of baptism itself was a powerful symbol of cleansing. To be baptized was to be washed of original sin, initiated into the Christian life with water as the sacred medium. While infant baptism was most common, adult baptism still occurred, particularly among converts, and these were deeply ceremonial. The water used in these rituals was often blessed and perfumed with herbs or oils, believed to purify both body and soul. In some traditions, the newly baptized would don fresh linen garments, the white cloth symbolizing spiritual purity and rebirth. Confession, too, had a subtle connection to cleanliness. Though it was a spiritual act, cleansing the soul of sin through penance, the language and symbolism used often mirrored physical hygiene. Sins were described as stains or filth to be washed away. Absolution was seen as a renewal, a washing of the heart. This parallel wasn't accidental. In a world where the body and soul were believed to reflect one another, maintaining personal cleanliness became part of a larger moral and theological discipline. Dirt, disorder, and decay could signify spiritual neglect, while grooming, washing, and orderliness suggested piety, discipline, and devotion. That said, the Church's teachings on cleanliness were complex. While it encouraged certain hygienic behaviors, it also warned against excessive vanity or indulgence in bodily pleasures. Bathing too frequently or caring too much about appearance could be seen as signs of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. Saints and ascetics were often praised for their willingness to forsake bodily comfort. Stories abounded of holy men and women who wore lice-infested robes, refused to bathe for years, or lived in filth as a sign of their detachment from worldly desires. Saint Francis of Assisi, for example, famously embraced poverty and dirt as signs of humility. Saint Margaret of Cortona refused to wash her body after entering religious life, believing it helped her focus on spiritual purity. This tension, between the value of cleanliness and the suspicion of vanity, created a unique set of hygiene practices among the devout. Washing was done modestly, often in private, and with a spirit of restraint. Mirrors were rare in monasteries and convents, and grooming tools were simple. Perfumes and cosmetics were frowned upon, particularly among religious women, and ornate grooming was associated with temptation or deceit. Yet the ideal was not filthiness. Rather, it was balance, a state of bodily maintenance that neither indulged the flesh nor neglected it. Clean hands for prayer, clean garments for Mass, and clean beds for rest were all seen as marks of dignity, not decadence. The Church also shaped hygiene through its control over medical care. Monasteries often served as early hospitals, and many monks and nuns were trained in basic medical practices, including hygiene. They administered baths, treated wounds, and applied ointments to the sick and elderly. Clean linens were provided for the infirm, and food was prepared with cleanliness in mind. In times of plague or illness, religious orders often led the response, caring for the dying, cleaning contaminated spaces, and organizing public rituals to purify the community. Holy water was sprinkled, incense was burned, and processions were held, all aimed at driving away disease, both physical and spiritual. In larger churches and cathedrals, hygiene extended to sacred objects and spaces. Altars were wiped with linen cloths soaked in wine or vinegar. Chalices were rinsed and polished. Clerical vestments were laundered with care, stored in special chests, and only worn after ritual washing. Priests were expected to wash their hands before handling the Eucharist, and acolytes were often tasked with cleaning and maintaining the sacred vessels. Even the church bells were sometimes washed or anointed, particularly before feast days or during consecration ceremonies. The language of filth and purity also found its way into sermons, songs, and religious art. Devils were often depicted as dirty, grotesque, and foul-smelling, while angels appeared radiant and clean. Hell was imagined as a place of slime, stench, and decay, while heaven gleamed with light, fragrance, and order. Pilgrimage routes featured wash stations or sacred springs, and arriving in a clean state was both a sign of respect and an act of penance. For the average believer, these symbols were powerful reminders that hygiene was not merely a domestic task. It was a spiritual discipline, one that reflected the state of the soul. Among the general population, church festivals also prompted acts of cleaning. The days leading up to Easter, Christmas, and other holy feasts often included household washing, laundering of linens, and personal bathing. People cleaned not only their homes but also their bodies, presenting themselves to God and their neighbors in a state of physical and moral preparation. In some regions, families prepared ritual baths on Christmas Eve or Easter morning, with water perfumed with herbs or petals, a symbol of renewal and holiness. Even death brought with it acts of hygienic care, grounded in faith. Bodies were washed before burial, often by women of the community or religious attendants. This was not only to prevent decay or odor but to prepare the soul for its journey. Clean white shrouds were wrapped around the body, sometimes after anointing with oil or holy water. In this final act, the washing of the body became a farewell, a sign of dignity, respect, and spiritual readiness for the next life. As we bring this chapter to a close, picture a quiet cloister garden at dusk. A monk kneels beside a stone basin, washing his hands in cool, flowing water. The chapel bells ring softly in the distance. A candle flickers beside a simple wooden towel rack. The air carries the scent of rosemary and smoke. Nearby, a sister prepares lavender water for the infirmary. A pilgrim arrives at the gate, weary from the road, eager to wash before entering the sacred nave. Within these small, reverent acts, the wiping of an altar, the rinsing of a basin, the careful folding of a clean habit, the soul and the body draw quietly closer, linked by the eternal rhythm of purity, humility, and care. Throughout the medieval world, the rhythms of daily hygiene were deeply shaped by gender, and for women in particular, maintaining personal cleanliness came with unique challenges, unspoken expectations, and quiet ingenuity. Their hygiene routines, often hidden from view and unrecorded by chroniclers of the time, played out in the private corners of homes, gardens, and convents. And yet, these routines were essential. They formed the backbone of household care, childbirth, family health, and self-respect in a world that offered few conveniences and even fewer comforts. Women not only managed their own bodily care but often bore the responsibility of caring for everyone else in the household, from infants to elders, from wounded husbands to menstruating daughters. Hygiene for women in the Middle Ages began, quite simply, with water, fetching it, boiling it, saving it, and using it again. In towns, women might gather at the public fountain or well early in the morning, filling wooden buckets and clay jugs to haul home on shoulders or carts. In rural areas, water came from nearby streams, ponds, or communal wells, sometimes a considerable walk from home. The process was labor-intensive and often fell to the women and older girls of the household. Once home, water was used for cooking, cleaning, and bathing, always in careful proportion. Boiling water over the hearth required additional time and fuel, so warm water for washing was a luxury, not an assumption. Personal bathing for women was usually done in private, and modesty was paramount. While mixed-gender bathing did occur in some regions, particularly in earlier medieval periods or in public bathhouses influenced by Roman or Islamic traditions, many women preferred or were required to bathe separately. When privacy allowed, a wooden tub was filled and placed near the hearth, sometimes screened with blankets or shutters for discretion. Bathing typically began with a full rinse, followed by scrubbing the skin with cloths or rough sponges. Women used herbal infusions in the water, rose petals, lavender, chamomile, or even vinegar, both for fragrance and as astringents. Hair washing was less frequent, but when done, it involved lathering with soapwood, ash lye, or animal fat soap, then rinsing thoroughly with fresh water or herbal tea made from rosemary or sage. Hair care held particular importance in female hygiene. Long hair was seen as a symbol of beauty and fertility, yet it required consistent care to remain clean and manageable. Combing was a daily ritual, not just for untangling but also for removing lice, which were a near-constant nuisance. Combs were carved from wood, horn, or bone, with both wide and fine teeth. Mothers often combed their daughters' hair by the hearth light in the evenings, using soothing oils, sometimes made from herbs steeped in animal fat or olive oil, to ease the process. Hair was typically braided or tied back, then covered with wimples, veils, or linen caps to keep it clean and reduce exposure to smoke, dirt, and insects. One of the most difficult and secretive aspects of female hygiene in the Middle Ages was the management of menstruation. This natural, monthly occurrence was rarely discussed openly, but every woman had to find a way to cope with it in a world that lacked disposable products, private toilets, or medical advice. Most women used folded rags made of linen or wool, sometimes secured with ties or belts known as sanitary girdles. These cloths were washed and reused, requiring discreet laundering, drying, and storage. In winter, they were often dried near the fire, hidden beneath other linens. In summer, they might be hung behind hedges or in upper windows, away from the eyes of men and strangers. For poorer women, or during times of hardship, natural materials like moss, grass, or softened bark were used in place of cloth. While less comfortable and hygienic, these alternatives were accessible and biodegradable. Herbal remedies were also used to regulate or ease menstruation. Parsley, yarrow, mugwort, and pennyroyal were among the plants women steeped into teas or used in poultices to relieve cramps, induce delayed periods, or manage irregular flow. Midwives, wise women, and older relatives often passed down this knowledge, creating a quiet lineage of female wisdom that flourished outside the bounds of official medicine. Pregnancy and childbirth brought their own set of hygiene challenges, often dealt with in secrecy and silence. Bathing was encouraged in the early stages of pregnancy but discouraged as labor approached, based on the belief that water might weaken the body or invite evil spirits. Women washed their bodies and hair more frequently during the early months, often in preparation for labor and the long confinement that followed. Clean linen sheets and towels were set aside for the birth, and water was kept warm on the hearth for washing the baby and wiping the mother. Midwives took great care to keep their hands and tools clean as possible, anyway, and would wash themselves before and after delivering a child. Some even carried herbal rinses or vinegar for sterilization, though their understanding of infection was limited. Postpartum hygiene was handled with extreme care. The new mother was typically confined to bed for a period of rest known as lying in, during which she was fed nourishing foods and kept warm. Herbal baths were prepared to help soothe soreness and prevent infection. A mixture of warm water, salt, lavender, and sage might be used for sitz baths or compresses. Linens were changed as often as possible, a task that required more effort than it might seem, considering the amount of labor involved in laundering and drying. The mother's hair was brushed, her hands and feet washed, and warm cloths applied to her belly to aid recovery. While pain relief was limited, the care she received during this period was both physical and emotional, a quiet ritual of restoration and community support. Beyond their own hygiene, women were often responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of the entire household. This included laundering the family's clothing and linens, preparing bathwater, sweeping floors, scrubbing cookware, and managing waste. Clean rushes or straw were spread across the floors to absorb dirt, and these had to be changed regularly, another chore managed by women. Urine pots and chamber pots had to be emptied and cleaned, sometimes daily. Herbal bundles were hung to freshen the air or tucked into bedding to deter fleas. A clean home reflected on the woman who ran it, and even among the poorest families, an effort was made to keep living spaces respectable and orderly. Socially, hygiene influenced a woman's reputation. A woman with clean hands, neat hair, and fresh-smelling clothing was viewed as diligent, moral, and marriageable. A woman who appeared disheveled or unwashed might be seen as slothful, wanton, or sickly. In courtly culture, women were often praised for their beauty, which included not only clear skin and lustrous hair but also the subtle use of fragrance. Scented waters, rose oil, or violet-scented sachets were used discreetly. In love poetry and songs, the ideal woman smelled of flowers or herbs, had skin fair as milk, and wore clean, finely embroidered linen. Of course, this was more fantasy than reality for most women, but the ideal still shaped how they presented themselves in public and private. In convents, hygiene was both a spiritual and practical duty. Nuns bathed infrequently, often only before major religious festivals, but they washed their hands and faces regularly, kept their habits clean, and cared for the sick in the infirmary with surprising attentiveness. Older nuns passed down practical wisdom: how to prepare herbal rinses, treat lice, manage chronic pain, or ease a woman's monthly cycle with prayer and plants. These skills, while rooted in religious devotion, were also born of necessity. In a cloistered life with limited resources, hygiene was part of survival. Among noblewomen, hygiene became more elaborate and more performative. Ladies had access to private chambers, heated bathwater, perfumed oils, and dedicated servants. Their hair was combed with silver or ivory combs, washed with floral water, and braided into elaborate styles. Hands were washed before and after meals, and scented cloths were provided to wipe the mouth. Special attention was given to the feet, as soaking and scrubbing became part of a noblewoman's grooming. Yet even among the wealthy, hygiene was not effortless. Everything, from heating bathwater to preparing fragrant oils, required servants, resources, and planning. Hygiene was also woven into women's religious rituals. Before entering church, women were expected to be clean, modestly dressed, and presentable. During menstruation, many believed they should refrain from receiving communion, though this was debated among theologians. Some women made pilgrimage to sacred springs or healing wells, bathing before praying for fertility, safe childbirth, or healing. These sacred waters were often associated with female saints or the Virgin Mary and became places of both spiritual and physical cleansing. Despite all this care, women's hygiene was often invisible in the historical record. Few chroniclers saw fit to describe the details of a woman's bathing routine or menstrual practices. And yet, these routines shaped their lives more than most public events. Through combing hair, changing linens, boiling water, and preparing herbal infusions, medieval women wove hygiene into the fabric of daily existence, not as a luxury, but as a labor of love, survival, and identity. As night falls on our imagined medieval world, picture a quiet corner of a cottage. A woman kneels by the fire, pouring warm water into a wooden basin. She dips a cloth, wrings it gently, and wipes her face. Her hair, long and damp from a rinse with rosemary, is braided slowly by her daughter. A bundle of mint hangs near the hearth to dry. In another room, clean linen lies folded for the morning. There is no audience, no chronicler to record the moment, only the soft sound of water, the rustle of cloth, and the deep, enduring rhythm of care. In this silence, in this gentleness, a story of hygiene unfolds, tender, unseen, and profoundly human. In the medieval world, hygiene was not simply a matter of routine maintenance for the able-bodied adult. It was also an act of compassion and necessity for those at the fragile edges of life, the very young, the very old, and the infirm. While much of medieval hygiene was improvised and constrained by the environment, these more vulnerable members of society were cared for in ways that reflected not only the customs of the time but also the quiet endurance of familial duty. At a time when modern medicine was still centuries away, tending to the sick or aged meant something more than managing illness. It meant washing, lifting, feeding, and soothing the body in its weakest state. From birth, children entered a world that required constant cleaning and careful attention. Medieval infants, once delivered, were washed in warm water, often by the midwife, and wrapped in swaddling cloths. These long strips of linen were wound tightly around the baby's limbs to keep them straight and protected, a practice that could last for weeks or months. Mothers and midwives washed the infant's body gently each day, paying attention to folds of skin where rashes could develop. Herbal washes were commonly used, chamomile for its soothing properties, or rosemary to discourage illness. Babies were usually bathed in small wooden tubs or large basins, placed near the hearth for warmth. Bath water was reused multiple times in most households, especially in the colder months, making hygiene a balancing act between practicality and care. Diapering as we know it did not exist, but cloth wrappings and pads were used to catch waste. These were changed as needed, though the frequency depended heavily on the household's resources and the weather. Soiled cloths were laundered in hot water when possible, or dried near the fire after rinsing. In poorer households, this task fell to mothers, older siblings, or wet nurses, while in wealthier homes it was delegated to nursemaids or female servants. Babies were also wiped with linen cloths dampened in warm water or herbal infusions. There was no standard diaper cream, but salves made from animal fat, beeswax, or herbal pastes were applied to prevent or treat rashes. Cleanliness was not merely cosmetic, it was essential to the baby's survival. As children grew older, their hygiene routines shifted with their independence. Toddlers often ran barefoot, especially in warmer months, and clothing was kept simple. Mothers wiped their faces, hands, and feet each morning and before meals, usually with cloths dipped in cool water or with dampened fingers. Combing the hair became part of the daily rhythm, not only to remove tangles but to prevent lice and spot illness early. Lice were an expected part of life, but still actively managed. Children were regularly checked for sores, swelling, or unusual smells, early signs of infection in a world where disease often struck without warning. Baths were given when possible, though rarely more than once or twice a month unless illness required it. Teaching children about hygiene began informally. There were no toothbrushes, but children were taught to rinse their mouths, chew herbs, and wipe their teeth with cloth. They watched their mothers and older siblings manage waste and water, and they learned when and how to clean themselves. Modesty was introduced early, especially for girls, who were taught to wash discreetly and keep their bodies covered. Boys might learn to shave under their father's supervision, or help fetch water for washing. In towns, children might visit public bathhouses with their parents. In villages, they learned to bathe in streams or wash in shared tubs, often laughing and playing while elders scolded them into washing behind the ears. Caring for elders required just as much patience and tenderness. As people aged, their ability to manage hygiene declined, and family members, especially women, stepped in to help. Elderly parents might need assistance with bathing, changing clothes, brushing hair, or even feeding. In multigenerational households, a grandmother might sleep near the hearth, where it was warmer and easier to manage nighttime needs. She might be helped to the privy or use a chamber pot placed beside the bed, emptied discreetly each morning. Her linens were changed less often than ideal, but with regularity, and cloths soaked in warm herb water were used to wipe her face and hands. Scented bundles might be tucked beneath her pillow, and a comb passed through her hair each morning as a small act of dignity. The elderly suffered from ailments we still recognize today: joint pain, failing eyesight, tooth loss, and incontinence. Without modern medicine, comfort and cleanliness became the main tools of care. Gentle massages with warmed oils, regular brushing of limbs, foot baths with salt or lavender, and boiled compresses applied to stiff joints were part of the caregiving ritual. Woolen socks and extra blankets kept chills at bay. For those with open sores or skin conditions, herbal salves were applied carefully, with linen bandages changed when fresh ones were available. In monasteries and convents, older monks and nuns were similarly cared for, often by novices or lay attendants who were taught the virtues of humility and gentle service through this daily labor. Illness, temporary or chronic, brought hygiene concerns to the forefront of medieval life. In the absence of hospitals as we know them, the sick were cared for at home or in monastic infirmaries. Washing the sick was one of the most critical and symbolic acts of compassion, and it was often performed by women. The body was sponged with cloths soaked in herbal broths or lightly salted water, especially when fever caused sweating or when injury had left wounds or blood. In wealthier homes, a full bath might be prepared to lower the fever or draw out bad humors. For most, however, the body was cleaned in parts: the face, hands, chest, and feet, using bowls of warm water and linen rags wrung dry between rinses. Bedding had to be changed or aired out, though this was a demanding task. Straw mattresses were fluffed and exposed to the sun if possible. Sheets were washed and dried slowly, sometimes over several days, depending on the weather. Soiled clothing was removed, and fresh linen, if available, was dressed on the patient. In many cases, extra garments or strips of fabric were sewn into makeshift diapers for those too weak to rise or control their needs. Chamber pots were used at the bedside, then emptied and rinsed outside. Herbs were burned or hung near the bed to sweeten the air and drive away miasmas. Rue, juniper, and bay leaves were among the most common choices. For those suffering from contagious diseases, hygiene became a defensive act. Caregivers wore cloths over their faces, sometimes soaked in vinegar or wine. They washed their hands more frequently, avoided sharing utensils, and burned the linens or clothing of the sick if instructed by the local priest or healer. These practices were inconsistent and rooted more in tradition than science, but they reflected an intuitive understanding of the need to separate and cleanse. The Black Death in the 14th century intensified these efforts. Entire households were burned to prevent the spread, and plague victims were often buried in clean shrouds, when burial was possible, with their bodies washed or anointed by the few brave enough to remain close. Despite the fear of contagion, there was immense respect for those who tended the sick. In religious texts and community tales, women who washed the dying, men who buried the infected, and nuns who sponged the wounds of the poor were honored as saints in their own right. The act of cleaning the unclean was seen as a sacred duty. The wiping of a fevered brow, the lifting of a weak limb, the laundering of blood-stained linen, these were not just chores but acts of courage and compassion. Among the peasantry, hygiene during illness was managed as best as possible with what little was available. Ailing family members were kept warm near the hearth. Steam baths were improvised with pots of boiling water and heavy blankets. Sore throats were soothed with cloths soaked in wine or vinegar, wrapped around the neck and secured with pins. Coughs were treated with herbal teas and honey. When death seemed near, the body was washed, sometimes with holy water, sometimes with simple well water, and laid out on fresh linen if available. Women tended to women, and men to men, preserving modesty where they could. Children watched quietly, learning without words how to care for the fragile, the weak, and the dying. The memory of these acts often lingered in the community, told in hushed tones, how a daughter kept her father clean during his final days, how a mother combed her child's hair before the fever took her, how a brother carried water every morning for his bedridden sister. In a world without hospitals, these personal rituals were the only medicine available to many. And through them, hygiene took on a deeper meaning, not just as a practice of cleanliness, but as a testament to love. As our chapter comes to rest, imagine a quiet bedroom in the upper floor of a timber-framed home. A young girl lies asleep, recovering from fever. Beside her, her mother sits, dipping a cloth into a bowl of lavender water and wiping the girl's hands. A candle flickers, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The scent of rosemary lingers. A fresh tunic lies folded on a nearby stool. A dog rests at the foot of the bed. Outside, the town is dark and still. But in this quiet room, the ritual of hygiene continues, slow, steady, and sacred. It is not loud. It is not grand. But it is everything. Though much of medieval hygiene took place within the home, monastery, or bathhouse, the public spaces of daily life played a powerful, and often problematic, role in the collective health and cleanliness of society. Streets, marketplaces, wells, inns, and even places of worship were gathering points where people, animals, food, and waste converged. These environments were alive with activity, vibrant, loud, and teeming with movement, but they were also, inevitably, messy. Maintaining cleanliness in such spaces was a constant struggle, shaped by civic regulations, community habits, and improvised efforts to keep filth at bay. In the medieval world, public hygiene was not so much enforced as it was negotiated, shared among neighbors with a mixture of duty, necessity, and reluctant tolerance. To understand public hygiene in a medieval town or city, one need only look to the streets. Unpaved and uneven, often muddy even in dry weather, they were rarely empty and never clean. Cobbled walkways helped in wealthier districts, but even these were slick with animal droppings, bits of hay, spilled ale, and human refuse. Most medieval towns lacked enclosed sewage systems. Instead, open gutters, called kennels, ran along the sides or even down the center of the street. These were meant to carry away rainwater and waste, but in reality, they collected detritus and stagnated in warm months, giving rise to clouds of flies and swarms of rats. People contributed to this condition in 1,000 small ways. Butchers tossed blood and entrails into alleyways. Fishmongers discarded heads and scales onto the cobblestones. Bakers swept ash and flour from their thresholds. Residents, especially those in upper stories of tightly packed homes, emptied chamber pots into the streets below. Though some cities developed customs like shouting, "Where below?" or "Gardelo," before tossing waste, the warning was more polite gesture than guarantee of safety. Being struck by the contents of a chamber pot was a known occupational hazard of simply walking to the market. In an attempt to address this, town councils passed ordinances regulating waste disposal. These laws varied in effectiveness and enforcement but often included requirements for residents to clean the area in front of their homes, penalties for dumping offal near water sources, and designated places for dung heaps or animal slaughter. In London, for example, by the 14th century, officials assigned rakers and scavengers to sweep the streets and remove waste. Fines were imposed on those who allowed their pigs to roam freely or who blocked gutters with debris. Some towns even had gong farmers, men employed to clean out latrines and cesspits, working at night to avoid public offense. Their work was foul but vital, and they were paid relatively well, even as they were socially shunned for the smell that clung to them. The town square or marketplace was one of the dirtiest, and most important, locations in any settlement. Here, hygiene clashed with economy in full force. Merchants sold produce, meat, textiles, and pottery from stalls that were rarely cleaned between market days. Food was laid out on open boards or carts, exposed to dust, flies, and the jostling crowds. Hand-washing stations did not exist, and waste from animals used for transportation, horses, oxen, and donkeys, accumulated quickly. Smells mingled, the sweetness of ripe fruit, the sourness of spilled milk, the sharpness of urine, the tang of fish and blood, the smoke of roasting meat. Yet for many, This was the heart of life, where goods were bartered, news was shared, and social ties reinforced. Attempts to improve market hygiene included building covered stalls, draining areas with stone channels, and designating butchers' quarters away from open wells or bakeries. In some cities, strict rules forbade selling spoiled meat, and officials inspected goods to ensure freshness. Vendors might rinse produce in communal troughs or use cloths to wipe benches, but such gestures were modest at best. Most shoppers learned to inspect items carefully and to trust only certain vendors. Bread baked in street ovens was often preferred over home-baked loaves, not for taste, but because the oven itself was shared and well heated, a kind of public assurance of cleanliness. Wells and public fountains were lifelines of hygiene, but they, too, faced constant risk of contamination. Cities often built fountains fed by aqueducts or natural springs, protected by stonework and maintained by town officials. These were public gathering spots, particularly for women, who fetched water, washed vegetables, and sometimes rinsed laundry. Yet the same proximity that made fountains convenient also made them dangerous. People washed hands, filled drinking jugs, watered animals, and sometimes even rinsed chamber pots in the same basin. In times of plague or drought, fear of bad water led to panic, and wells were sometimes blamed for illness. Protective charms or religious blessings were placed near the fountains to guard against misfortune, and some cities passed ordinances banning certain behaviors near water sources, though with little consistency. Bathhouses, where they existed, straddled the line between private and public hygiene. In earlier medieval centuries, public bathhouses flourished in cities like Paris, London, and Cologne, offering hot water, soap, and space to scrub. While some were simple wooden buildings with basic tubs and benches, others were elaborate, with steam rooms, changing areas, and attendants. Mixed bathing occurred in some places, while in others, men and women bathed separately or on different days. These bathhouses were centers not only of washing, but of community. People gossiped, played music, ate snacks, and conducted business between scrubbings. Physicians sometimes recommended bathing for medicinal purposes, and the sick were brought in to soak or steam. Yet by the late Middle Ages, bathhouses declined, partly due to fears of disease, partly due to shifting religious attitudes. The spread of syphilis and other illnesses led some towns to close public baths altogether. Clergy warned of immoral behavior in shared baths, and regulations were passed to monitor or eliminate such spaces. In their absence, people returned to household bathing or visited riverbanks when weather permitted. The loss of these public spaces strained collective hygiene, and cities grew dirtier as a result. Inns, taverns, and hostels presented another frontier of hygiene. Travelers arriving in town sought rest, food, and shelter, but what they received varied greatly. A bed might be no more than straw on the floor. Linens were rarely changed, and bedbugs, fleas, and lice were common companions. Shared chamber pots, greasy utensils, and smoky air were the norm. Some inns made efforts to improve conditions: bowls of warm water for washing, clean straw, and herbal bundles placed beneath pillows to sweeten the air. But standards varied widely. In larger cities, travelers with means sought out reputable goose houses, while the poor made do in the common rooms of roadside taverns or under the open sky. Religious spaces, while often cleaner than taverns, still faced challenges. Pilgrims traveled long distances, many on foot, arriving dusty, unwashed, and hungry. Churches and shrines accommodated them, offering water for washing and sometimes small hostels for rest. Communal sleeping areas were crowded, and outbreaks of lice or illness were common. Priests encouraged cleanliness before entering holy spaces, and some churches built fountains or wash basins near entrances for this purpose. Holy water itself was believed to purify, and worshippers crossed themselves not only in reverence, but in the hope of literal cleansing. Yet despite these efforts, large gatherings, especially during feast days, overwhelmed any sanitation system in place. One overlooked public space in medieval hygiene was the cemetery. Contrary to modern assumptions, cemeteries were often social spaces, places of gathering, prayer, and even market activity. Vendors set up stalls along the edges, and people walked among graves to reach the church. Waste sometimes accumulated here, especially in overused burial grounds where bodies were layered atop one another. Gravediggers cleaned their tools in nearby fountains or left refuse piled in corners. Some churches built ossuaries or charnel houses to handle the overflow, storing bones respectfully while trying to preserve space and reduce odor. Washing of the dead, both symbolic and practical, was part of funeral rituals, and women often took responsibility for this final act of care. Despite all of these public challenges, there were efforts, both official and communal, to improve urban hygiene. Some towns appointed keepers of the streets, early sanitation officers who inspected gutters, wells, and bathhouses. Public punishments existed for those who dumped refuse illegally. Walls and posts were marked with symbols warning against urinating or littering. On feast days, citywide cleaning occurred, streets were swept, fountains scrubbed, and rushes replaced. Guilds and brotherhoods sometimes sponsored these efforts, and local lords occasionally paid for improvements to public sanitation in the name of piety or reputation. Still, medieval public hygiene was always a fragile balance, a mix of personal effort and public neglect, of civic pride and communal fatigue. And yet, people adapted. They stepped carefully through alleyways, chose vendors by scent and reputation, carried cloths for wiping hands, and learned to identify the cleaner corners of public life. In a world without soap dispensers, paved sidewalks, or waste collection, hygiene was not a system, it was a habit, a negotiation, a communal performance shaped by daily necessity. As this chapter closes, imagine a bustling square at twilight. The last vendors pack their wares. A servant pours a bucket of water onto the stones outside a shop. A young girl fetches clean water from the fountain while holding a cloth to her nose. A monk stops to wash his hands before entering the church. The smells linger: roasting meat, wet hay, spilled ale. But above it all floats the cool scent of evening air and distant rain. Amid the dirt, there is order. Amid the noise, intention. Amid the filth, a shared desire, however imperfect, to remain clean, presentable, and whole. In the medieval world, personal hygiene was not merely about washing the skin or laundering the clothes. It was a constant, low-level battle against the creeping, crawling realities of daily life. Lice nesting in the seams of garments, fleas leaping from straw beds, rats gnawing beneath floorboards, and unseen insects thriving in every shadowed corner. Cleanliness, then, was as much about defense as it was about comfort. And while water, soap, and herbs played their part, medieval people also relied on sharp eyes, practiced hands, and generations of hard-earned wisdom in the quiet war against vermin. Perhaps the most persistent of these unwelcome guests were lice. Head lice and body lice were so common that their presence was almost expected, even among the wealthiest members of society. They thrived in the folds of fabric, along seams, beneath head coverings, and close to the skin where warmth and moisture allowed them to breed. Medieval people referred to lice in literature, song, and sermons, not always with disgust, but often with weary acceptance. They were part of the fabric of life, mentioned with the same regularity as rain or smoke. But acceptance did not mean surrender. Daily combing was the first line of defense, and nearly every household owned at least one knit comb, a narrow-toothed tool carved from wood, bone, or horn. These combs were passed carefully through the hair, often in the morning or evening hours when families gathered by the hearth. The process was meticulous, often requiring assistance from another person. Mothers combed their children's hair while singing softly or telling stories. Sisters helped sisters. In convents, nuns took turns inspecting each other's scalps, both as a hygienic practice and an act of humility. The findings, tiny white nits or active lice, were crushed between fingernails or pressed into cloths and burned. Shaving the head was another common solution, especially among monks and some clerics. The tonsure, a circular patch shaved at the crown of the head, served religious purposes but also reduced the area in which lice could hide. In warmer regions, or in times of infestation, men and boys might shave their heads entirely. Women, for reasons of modesty and social expectation, typically kept their hair long and covered, making the battle more complicated. Scarves, veils, and coifs were regularly laundered and aired out in sunlight to kill any lingering pests. Fleas, though smaller and harder to spot, were arguably more troublesome. Unlike lice, which lived on the body or in clothing, fleas nested in bedding, straw mattresses, rugs, and the crevices of wooden floors and walls. They were notoriously hard to eliminate, biting humans and animals alike, and they multiplied quickly. People awoke with rows of bites along their legs or necks, scratching at the itching welts without fully understanding the source. Dogs and cats, though useful for catching rats, were also hosts for flea populations, and their presence in homes created a steady cycle of reinfestation. To control fleas, medieval people turned to herbs and smoke. Bundles of aromatic plants, such as lavender, rosemary, rue, pennyroyal, and wormwood, were tucked into mattresses, placed beneath pillows, or scattered across sleeping pallets. These herbs were believed to repel pests with their strong odors and, in some cases, were mildly effective. Floors were strewn with fresh rushes mixed with these plants, and bedding was shaken out daily, especially in spring and summer. In more serious cases, people fumigated rooms with burning herbs or sulfur, a smoky ritual that left walls sooty and clothing infused with sharp scent, but sometimes brought relief. Rats and mice, meanwhile, posed a different kind of hygiene concern. They gnawed at stored grain, nibbled on soap, chewed through candle stubs, and sometimes climbed into beds. In cities, rats thrived in the gutters and alleys, nesting beneath houses and breeding in cesspits. While medieval people did not understand germ theory, they did observe the correlation between rats and disease, particularly during the plagues that swept Europe in waves. Efforts to control them were largely reactive. Cats were the primary defense, kept in homes and barns not as pets, but as working animals. Some were semi-wild, tolerated more than loved, encouraged to stay with scraps and warmth. Dogs, too, were used to chase or alert against rodents, though less effectively. Traps were crude but functional, buckets baited with food and tipped to trap rats alive, or snares crafted from bent twigs and twine. In wealthier homes, dedicated rat catchers might be hired. These men roamed towns with dogs, sticks, and baskets, displaying their catches for coin and sometimes offering talismans or folk remedies to keep rats away. In port cities, the problem was more acute, as rats traveled on ships and spread quickly. Ship rats became the bane of warehouses and inns, and strict regulations were occasionally passed to control food storage and dock sanitation. Among the nobility, vermin control took on an air of formality. Castles and manors employed staff whose duties included turning mattresses, beating rugs, cleaning rushes, and fumigating chambers. Bed linens were changed with greater frequency, and scented sachets were placed in clothing chests to deter both fleas and moths. Some noblewomen used ambergris, musk, or other exotic substances believed to purify air and repel pests. While these efforts were more elegant in appearance, they were not always more effective. Infestations knew no social boundary. Public institutions also struggled with vermin. Monasteries conducted regular cleanings of cloisters and dormitories, shaking out blankets and replacing straw mattresses during liturgical seasons or major feast days. Infirmaries and ghosthouses had to be especially vigilant, as the movement of travelers and the sick brought with it new hosts for parasites. Schools and almshouses were likewise affected, and lice inspections, though informal, were not uncommon. Children were sometimes deloused before being allowed into public spaces or into the care of charity institutions. Clothing maintenance was another front line in the war against pests. In addition to laundering, people beat clothes with sticks, hung them in sunlight, or smoked them over fire to kill lice and eggs. Some households kept special hooks above the hearth for this purpose, where tunics, cloaks, and headwear could be aired or lightly scorched. Wool garments, which were harder to clean, received particular attention. Linen, being easier to wash, was often layered beneath to protect the skin and absorb sweat, thus reducing the appeal for lice. The simple act of changing one's linen shirt was considered a basic, essential act of hygiene, and for those who could afford it, linen underclothes were changed more frequently than outer garments. Travel posed special risks. Inns and taverns were notorious for harboring lice and fleas. Travelers often brought their own blankets or straw mats to avoid sharing bedding, and some carried sachets of herbs or bottles of vinegar to wipe down benches and wash hands. Pilgrims on long journeys frequently shaved their heads or kept their hair covered. Those returning from ports or plague zones were viewed with suspicion, not only for disease but for lice and rats they might bring with them. In some towns, travelers were quarantined or inspected before being allowed to enter city gates. Vermin also appeared in the language and thought of the time. Lice, fleas, and rats were not only pests but symbols. Lice, for example, were often used in sermons and morality tales as symbols of sin, pride, or the decay of the soul. Rats were associated with death, chaos, and the underworld. Fleas, with their biting and blood-sucking, were compared to gossip, temptation, or devilry. The persistence of these creatures in daily life left an imprint on the medieval imagination, showing up in poems, songs, and even illuminated manuscripts. Some marginalia show monks picking lice from their robes or animals chasing fleas, a visual nod to the ever-present struggle. Despite all these difficulties, there was ingenuity. Soap makers added flea-repelling herbs to their bars. Women crafted necklaces of dried rue and wormwood for children. Rat traps became more refined in design. Markets sold powdered substances, ashes, lime, and chalk, to sprinkle across thresholds and beneath bedding. Folk remedies abounded, passed quietly from grandmother to daughter, from midwife to maid, onion skins placed in shoes, rosemary boiled and rubbed into the scalp, vinegar baths for undergarments, ash layered beneath new straw mats. These may not have always worked, but they represented a kind of hopeful persistence, a belief that the body and home could be kept in order, however humble or fleeting that order might be. As we close this chapter, picture a quiet room in early spring. The rushes have just been swept and replaced. A woman shakes out the linens, clapping them against the breeze. A child sits still while her mother combs through her hair, humming softly as she picks and searches. On the hearth, a pot of water simmers with rosemary and mint, ready to rinse cloths. A cat stretches beneath a bench, ears twitching. In the rafters above, the mice scurry, still out of reach. But for now, there is peace. For now, the bed is clean, the comb is full, and the room smells of smoke and green things, a moment of victory in the endless, quiet war for bodily peace. In the medieval world, where homes had no insulation, water came from the earth, and fire was the only source of warmth. The seasons dictated far more than what people wore or when they harvested crops. The changing of the weather reshaped the entire rhythm of daily life, including the way people kept themselves clean. Hygiene was not a fixed routine, repeated with clockwork precision, but a flexible set of habits, constantly adjusted to the shifting light, temperature, and availability of resources. From spring's thawing streams to winter's frozen basins, medieval hygiene moved with the year like a tide, responding to nature's moods and constraints. Spring was, in many ways, the season of cleansing. After the long, soot-filled months of winter, when fires had burned day and night, and bodies were kept swaddled in wool and linen, the arrival of warmer weather brought a kind of ritual renewal. The snow melted, rivers swelled, and wells ran faster. People opened shutters to air out homes, swept soot from hearths, and beat dust from rugs and tapestries. Bedding was aired, rushes replaced, and clothes that had not been washed in months were finally scrubbed and rinsed in cold water. This period often coincided with Lent and Easter, which brought not only spiritual reflection but also practical opportunities for purification. Households made time for spring bathing, not necessarily as a weekly habit, but as a seasonal event. Wooden tubs were filled, sometimes outdoors, with water from nearby streams. Herbs were steeped for added freshness, rosemary, thyme, or meadowsweet, and hair was washed more thoroughly than usual. Children were scrubbed behind the ears and under the fingernails, adults took the opportunity to trim hair and nails, and household tools like combs and cloths were inspected, cleaned, or replaced. The longer days meant more sunlight for drying clothes and linens, and many homes took on the scent of warm soap and drying linen as part of spring's broader renewal. Spring was also the start of flea and lice season. As animals returned to pasture and warmer temperatures brought dormant insects back to life, families redoubled their efforts to keep bedding clean and herbs fresh. Lavender sachets were remade, straw in mattresses was replaced or fluffed, and combing routines resumed with daily regularity. While full-body baths were still rare, people washed hands, feet, and faces more often in spring, enjoying the coolness of stream water and the blessing of longer daylight hours to complete chores before nightfall. As summer took hold, hygiene reached its most active, and paradoxically, its most challenging, phase. The heat encouraged more frequent washing, especially of the hands, face, and feet, but it also increased the risks of illness, insect bites, and spoiled food. People perspired heavily beneath layers of clothing, and those with access to water sought out riverbanks or garden tubs more often. Public bathhouses, where available, saw more visitors, and some communities allowed for bathing in outdoor cisterns or large communal barrels filled with water for multiple uses. Yet summer brought hazards as well. Open wounds festered more easily, food spoiled quickly, and stagnant water bred mosquitoes and illness. In cities, the gutters and waste pits began to smell more strongly, and efforts were made to sweep streets, remove refuse, and fumigate buildings with burning herbs. People chewed fennel or cloves to sweeten breath, applied vinegar rinses to their skin to cool the blood, and increased their use of scented herbs to repel flies and fleas. Head coverings were worn more diligently, not only for modesty but to protect against lice and sunburn alike. Laundry was easier in summer, and families took advantage of the sun and heat to wash and dry linen more frequently. Clothes were boiled when possible, then spread across bushes, fences, or rooftop lines to dry quickly in the open air. Washing was a social activity, often performed in groups near streams or fountains, where women laughed, gossiped, and shared news while scrubbing garments against stones or in large basins. The heat allowed for efficient drying, and households managed to maintain a sense of order and freshness during these long, busy days. Summer was also the time when parasites and vermin thrived, and many homes escalated their efforts to protect against infestation. Pets were inspected for fleas. Rushes on the floor were refreshed weekly instead of monthly. Baskets of herbs were kept near sleeping areas, and families took turns inspecting mattresses and underclothes. For those who could afford it, summer was also a season of retreat to country manors, where fresh air and less crowded quarters provided brief respite from the stench and stress of the town. Autumn, as the harvest season, brought new concerns and rituals. It was a time of gathering and preserving, not only food but cleanliness as well. The rush to prepare for winter meant stockpiling soap, drying herbs, boiling and drying extra linen, and inspecting clothing for damage. Bathing became less frequent as temperatures cooled, and household water was conserved for cooking and brewing. However, the first chill of autumn often prompted one last round of bathing before the true cold set in. At this time, homes were sealed more tightly. Windows were shuttered, and cracks were stuffed with straw or rags. Smoke returned to the air as hearths were lit daily, bringing with it a new layer of soot and dryness. Skin became chapped, and people rubbed their hands and faces with tallow or oils to retain moisture. In some regions, linen undergarments were layered more thickly in autumn, protecting both against lice and the coming cold. Shoes were repaired, and foot washing, though less frequent, was prioritized on market days or feast days when people traveled. One of the key rituals of autumn was the change in sleeping arrangements. In warmer months, families sometimes slept in open spaces or shared rooms with open shutters. But by late autumn, families moved back into shared, enclosed quarters, with increased risk of illness. As a precaution, blankets and beds were inspected, and herbs were burned or sprinkled over straw to ward off disease. Vinegar-soaked cloths were kept near bedsides, and feet were often washed at night, both for comfort and warmth. The daily hygiene routines became quieter, more selective: hands and faces in the morning, feet and teeth at night, linen changed every few days, full baths rarely undertaken unless illness struck. Then came winter, the true test of medieval hygiene. With cold seeping in through walls and floors, washing became both rare and strategic. Water had to be broken from ice, hauled through snow, and heated slowly over the hearth. Bathing, when it occurred, was planned carefully. A single heated bath might be shared by an entire household, with the youngest children washed first, followed by older siblings, then parents, and finally, the elderly. By the time the last person entered the water, it was often tepid and cloudy, but still a luxury. Instead of full-body washing, people turned to partial routines. Hands were wiped clean with damp cloths warmed by the fire. Faces were gently rinsed in the morning with a basin kept near the hearth. Feet were washed only when truly necessary, and oils were rubbed into dry skin to prevent cracking. Linen was changed, but not as often. Drying clothes indoors was difficult, and the cold air made handling wet fabric miserable. Instead, people aired their clothes near the fire or hung them in covered porches to freshen them without washing. The smells of winter were distinct. Smoke clung to everything: hair, clothing, bed linen. The scent of wool, wax, dried herbs, and stored food filled homes. Cleanliness came in different forms: fresh rushes sprinkled with thyme, smoke from juniper branches, or vinegar used to wipe door handles and table edges. Scented pomanders were clutched in cold hands during church services. Babies were swaddled more heavily, and elderly family members were moved closer to the hearth to prevent chill and reduce the need for washing. During winter, the emotional weight of hygiene also shifted. Cleanliness was not just about looking or feeling fresh. It was a small act of resistance against the gloom, the cold, and the creeping stagnation of long nights. A clean face or a fresh-smelling pillow could offer a sense of renewal. Combings were performed by firelight, fingers cold and slow. Teeth were rubbed with salt or mint, and mouths rinsed with warm vinegar. The flicker of the hearth became the center of hygiene, not only providing warmth but the heat necessary to clean, dry, and comfort. As winter approached its deepest point, and the days began, ever so slowly, to grow longer, people clung to their modest routines with renewed hope. The first day warm enough to open a window or pour water outdoors without freezing was cause for quiet celebration. It signaled the slow turning of the year, the approach of better days, and the return of the fuller hygiene practices that spring would bring again. And so the cycle continued, year after year, season after season, with hygiene ebbing and flowing like the tides of the moon. It was never constant. It was never complete. But it was never forgotten. Medieval people understood, intuitively and communally, that keeping clean was not simply a matter of bathing or scrubbing. It was a ritual of adaptation, a practice built on timing, observation, and care. To wash was to align oneself with the world's rhythms. To change one's linen was to push back against decay. To hang a sachet of dried herbs was to reclaim a little space from the dark. As we close this chapter, imagine a small stone cottage in late December. A mother rinses her face beside the hearth while her children share a cup of warm water. A man brushes his coat near the fire, watching snow fall silently outside. A line of damp socks hangs from a wooden peg. Rosemary burns gently in a bowl beside the bed. Though the cold presses in, the people within remain clean, not in the way we think of it now, but in their own resilient, seasonal way. They are prepared. They are present. And in the quiet dark, they are waiting for spring. As we draw this gentle exploration to a close, it's worth pausing to consider the deeper, quieter meanings of hygiene in the medieval world, beyond the soapy basins, the flea-repelling herbs, and the laundry flapping in the sun. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was not only about the body. It was about status, belief, identity, and the fragile attempt to carve out dignity in a world where discomfort was constant and death never far. To be clean, in whatever form that took, was not merely to be free of dirt. It was to assert one's place in society. It was to communicate piety, discipline, hospitality, and self-respect in a time when few could afford the luxury of daily bathing or fresh linen. The distinction between the clean and the unclean ran deep in medieval thought. It shaped religious rituals, social hierarchies, gender expectations, and even the laws that governed daily life. In many contexts, cleanliness was less about sanitation as we understand it today and more about symbolic purity, a visible expression of inward virtue. A monk in a freshly laundered habit might not have bathed in months, but his clean hands and trimmed nails told a story of order and devotion. A noblewoman, powdered and perfumed, might have gone weeks without washing her hair, but her embroidered veil and white linen chemise signaled refinement and control. Among the aristocracy, cleanliness served as a marker of class. Nobles had access to resources that allowed them to maintain appearances, even if practical hygiene remained difficult. Their homes had better ventilation, their servants kept clothing fresh, and their furniture, like carved wooden chests and cushioned benches, could be wiped, covered, and arranged for appearances. Linen underclothes were changed more frequently, and bedding was kept fresher by a rotation of clean sheets. Scented waters and imported soaps were treasured gifts, and some noblemen carried pomanders or sweet-smelling gloves as daily accessories. A clean appearance, achieved with the help of many unseen hands, reinforced their role as the guardians of civility, wealth, and divine favor. For the clergy, cleanliness was a tool of sanctity. Priests, monks, and nuns lived lives of intentional austerity, but their appearance mattered greatly. Vestments were to be spotless. Hands were to be washed before Massachusetts church linens were bleached and changed with ritual care. These acts had meaning. They were offerings to God, symbols of inward purification. The faithful followed suit, washing before entering sacred spaces, donning clean clothes on holy days, and ensuring that death, when it came, was met in a state of bodily as well as spiritual readiness. In this world, to be clean was to be prepared. To be washed was to be worthy. Among the merchant classes, hygiene had practical as well as social significance. A baker with flour in her hair and soot on her sleeves might still wash her hands between customers. A cobbler might wear stained clothes but keep his tools and workspace neat. Artisans often developed personal standards for appearance based on guild expectations and customer interaction. A clean storefront was an invitation. A tidy appearance was a sign of competence. Bathing was occasional, but washing the face and hands became habitual, especially in professions involving food or physical contact with customers. The barbers, surgeons, and bathhouse attendants of this class straddled the line between labor and healing, cleanliness and craft. For peasants and the poor, cleanliness was more elusive, not because it was less valued, but because it was harder to maintain. Water had to be carried long distances. Soap was made at home, if at all, from animal fat and ash. Clothes were washed less often, and straw mattresses were rarely changed. Yet even here, acts of hygiene persisted with quiet dignity. A woman might rinse her face before meals, change her child's ragged tunic for a cleaner one, or wash her husband's feet at the end of a long day in the fields. Men might scrub their hands before entering a chapel, clean their boots with straw before market, or smooth their beards with oil or water. These gestures, though small, carried weight, reminders of self-worth, shared humanity, and the unspoken desire to present oneself well, even when life offered little room for luxury. The divide between clean and unclean also shaped attitudes toward certain groups. Lepers, for instance, were marked not only by disease but by the visible signs of uncleanliness. Their clothing, bodies, and speech were seen as impure, and they were often banished to the outskirts of town. Beggars and the homeless, similarly, were judged by appearance. Torn clothes, matted hair, and foul odor became shorthand for sin, laziness, or moral failure. Yet not all of this was rooted in cruelty. Medieval society, constrained by fear and misinformation, genuinely believed that dirt and disorder carried danger, not only to the body, but to the soul. Women, more than men, bore the burden of managing cleanliness, for themselves and for others. A woman's virtue was often measured by her appearance and the neatness of her household. A clean child reflected a good mother. A tidy home suggested a worthy wife. Even in peasant cottages, efforts were made to hang herbs for scent, to change linens before guests arrived, to wash feet before bed. In noble households, ladies of the court had entire routines dedicated to grooming, scented hand-washing before meals, rosewater rinses before sleep, and frequent changes of undergarments. These rituals were not only practical, they were performances of status and femininity. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of hygiene in the Middle Ages was its deep intertwining with hospitality. To welcome a guest was to offer them not just food and drink, but water for washing. In castles, a basin and towel were brought before dinner. In monasteries, travelers were offered the chance to bathe and rest before joining the evening prayers. Even among peasants, a bowl of water might be set out, or a guest offered a piece of clean cloth for drying hands. Cleanliness in this context became a kind of gift, an act of service, respect, and mutual recognition. Despite the limitations of their world, medieval people cared deeply about being clean. They found ways to comb, rinse, launder, and scent their bodies and homes. They endured the cold splash of river water, the sting of lye soap, the tedium of combing lice from a child's scalp, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. They saw in cleanliness not just comfort, but community. Not just survival, but salvation. They knew that a body washed for Mass was a body prepared for grace. That a child wrapped in clean linen was one protected not just from illness, but from shame. That a woman with neat hair and scrubbed hands might not change the world, but she could shape her corner of it, creating, for a time, a space where order triumphed over filth, dignity over decay. And so, let us return one last time to that quiet scene we visited before, a small cottage at dusk, a low fire flickering, a basin of water resting on a wooden table. A father washes his hands after a day in the fields. A mother gently untangles her daughter's hair. A child sits cross-legged, wiping his feet with a damp cloth. The air smells of wood smoke, lavender, and worn linen. There is no grand ritual, no royal bathhouse, no silken gown or gilded mirror, just the soft murmur of care, the rhythm of clean hands, the patience of shared labor. Here, in this humble space, we find the heart of medieval hygiene. Not perfection, not purity, but persistence, a quiet, enduring belief that the body, however battered, is worthy of care. Thank you for spending time in the quiet corners of the past with me. As you rest now, may the soft rhythms of medieval life linger in your thoughts. The hush of linen hung to dry, the rustle of herbs tied in bundles, the gentle splash of water poured from hand to basin. Though their world was different, their desire for comfort, for dignity, for care, was not so far from ours. If this story helped bring a sense of stillness to your night, feel free to subscribe. Only if it brings you peace. Let me know where and when you're listening, whether you're drifting off in a quiet room, walking through the woods, or simply looking for a moment of calm. Until next time, take care of yourself, gently, patiently, just as they once did. Now dim the lights, let the fire burn low, and allow yourself to drift softly into sleep.